There's this kind of myth, there's kind of a thing about Chinese. People tend to mystify the Chinese characters as if they're magical in some ways, that they can communicate deep meanings that mere alphabets can't. And there is some point to that. There's a lot of information in the Chinese character. But I think the core of language is speaking and listening. And that's true of all languages. For thousands of years, people spoke Chinese all the time, and most of them were not able to write it or read it.
My guest today is David Moser, a professor at Capital Normal University in Beijing, where he teaches Chinese history and politics. I first encountered David's work through his 1991 essay, Why Chinese is So Damn Hard, which is possibly the most widely read blog post on Chinese language learning ever written. David is originally from Kansas and was trained as a jazz musician with degrees in music composition and trumpet. While studying at Indiana University, he became friends with Douglas Hofstadter, author of the influential book Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. At a party one evening, Hofstadter demonstrated his Chinese reading skills by reading the characters on a Chinese restaurant takeout box. This chance event sparked David's interest in Chinese and would change the trajectory of his life entirely. He experienced what he describes as an inexplicable obsession with the Chinese language and began teaching himself Chinese. In 1986, after studying the language for just 3 years, David was invited to Peking University to help translate Gödel, Escher, Bach. What began as a translation project became a decades-long residence in China. During this time, David witnessed and participated in the country's extraordinary transformation from a developing agrarian society into the world power it is today. So David Moser, you were a music student at Indiana University in the 1980s, and you're originally from Kansas, so I assume you'd spent most of your life in the Midwest. Tell the story about how you ended up at Peking University in China in 1986.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll tell the short version of the story because it's a bit complicated. But yes, I did grow up in the Midwest. And since I was, I guess, in high school, I wanted to be a musician. So I picked up the trumpet and played guitar and played in rock bands and all this. And then I said, my career was going to be in music. So I got an undergraduate degree in composition and then went to Indiana University to get a master's. And here's the part that doesn't make much sense. For some reason, when I got there, I just got interested in languages for some reason. And I started learning French and learned it well enough to have conversations. But a friend of mine named Douglas Hofstadter, who was a professor at Indiana University, we were friends, and he spoke some Chinese. We were at a dinner party or something, and people said, what is this food in the boxes they sent? And he said, oh, this must be chicken, and this is... And I said, wow, you can actually read Chinese. And that was, for me, a kind of a strange obsession began. And I began to get books, like De Francis books, learning how to write characters. I would go to Chinese restaurants and try to, talk with the waiter and waitresses. I invited him to my house. I don't know. There was no reason why I would do such a thing.
How good was Hofstadter's Chinese? I mean, were you trying to outdo him, or?
No, he had taken he's a polyglot. He speaks at least 6 languages fairly fluently and wanted to add Chinese to it. He was at Stanford and took I think he took a semester, maybe 2 semesters of Chinese. So his pronunciation was good and he knew the basics of the language. But he was my first Chinese teacher, right? And he's a famous writer. His book Gödel, Escher, Bach won a Pulitzer Prize in 1979, I think. And so I was in Bloomington that time. We met up because I was the first person in the world to buy his book. Today.
Really?
Oh yeah. The bookstore in Bloomington got a crate or a box of the books of first print out of a courtesy to Hofstadter because that was his hometown. And I just happened to be in the bookstore, Howard's bookstore, one afternoon when I was there, and the bookstore owners are opening up these boxes. And I looked at the title of this book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. And I saw it was very thick. I said, this is either a total crackpot book,
yes,
or the most interesting book of the century, And I said,
yes.
Either way, I've just got to buy it, right? So I did. So I went to a composer seminar that evening, and a guy named Don Bird, who was one of Doug's best friends at the time, had done all the computer typesetting for the book. So Don had what he thought was the first book directly from Hofstadter himself, because it wasn't on sale yet. So he thought, I have the first printed book of GEB, what they call it, Gödel, Escher, Bach, right? So I went to this seminar and was standing there holding the book, and Don Bird came up to me and very agitated and pointed at this book, and he said, "Excuse me, where did you get that book?" And I thought, what? Is this book banned or something, or what's going on? And then he explained it to me, and so by a cosmic coincidence, I ended up meeting Doug, and had a huge effect on my life. So, having said all that, when Doug discovered that Peking University was translating his book, he had enough experience with various translations to know that most of the time the translators didn't get what that book was all about, especially the wordplay and puns and things. And he basically asked me, maybe even commanded me. He said, "You are going to go to Peking University and take part in the translation team."
So by then you already knew him pretty well, and
Yeah,
your Chinese had gotten up to snuff.
right. My Chinese has gotten much better. Reading not so great, writing not so great, but what the hell, I mean, how can I turn this down, right? So that's what brought me to Peking University, taking part in this, which turned to be years long translation project.
So he just said, "Here's a plane ticket.
Yep.
Go and do your thing."
Yeah. One of his colleagues was in contact with one of the people, a polymath named Ma Xiwen, and said, could my friend come and help translate your book? Because his English is perfect and he speaks Chinese and he knows the content of the book. And they said, yeah, great, fantastic. So there I was, a visiting scholar in 1986. No reason to be there, but this is how these things end up, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, everything hinged on the fact that you obtained this book and you had it visible. Yeah, and it's a pretty extraordinary story because GEB is a pretty renowned book. It's very famous. Even at that time, I think it was known in China before the translation had been available.
That's correct. There was a series, I think it was called Xiang Wei Lai or something like that. So it was basically little summaries or analysis of important books, and one of those was Gödel, Escher, Bach. So the book had already caused a stir among the intelligentsia.
And you had read it, and I assume you came down on the side of it being an interesting book, not a crackpot written book.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Right. Yeah, I think it turns out it wasn't exactly a crackpot book. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's this incredibly dense book, even for a native English speaker. And you're sent over there to basically supervise the team of people translating it. And so could you talk about what that was like? Because obviously, this is like nowadays when you translate something, you have a computer, you have all this software. A lot of the translation can even be completely automated, or not completely, but a lot of it can be automated. So what was it like, that process of you being there?
Right. Well, obviously this is 1986. By then, you had a thriving internet pretty much in the West, in the United States. They did not. And because of the problems of the Chinese script, they had not yet developed word processors. So for me, I went to my dorm room and they plopped down these huge stacks of handwritten Chinese from the translators, plural, because it actually took 3 or 4 people to translate it because there were so many domains. There was computer science, there was biology, philosophy. So they actually had got 4 different translators to translate the book. So I had to, sit down and look at this handwritten Chinese because they didn't write on word processors. So for me, it was a nightmare because, I'm looking at this page and I said, I can't understand any of these characters. They're just scrawled like reading my grandmother's handwriting, But luckily I had a code breaker, which was the original book. So I start with a sentence and it says, the function of computers is to facilitate blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, computer is in there. Somewhere in this sentence, there must be ji. And so it was pretty easy. Oh, there it is. You could actually simplify it in this way. So for me, the first half of a year was just learning how to decipher these sometimes almost illegible handwriting. Some were better than others. But actually, it was one of the best lessons of my life because I learned actually to read Chinese people's handwriting probably much better than most people. And also it was going painfully sentence by sentence trying to get the Chinese meaning. So it was also a lesson in translation. How does English translate into Chinese? What are the grammatical and syntactical issues that are involved? And then also having a lot of fun discovering that so many concepts that Doug, when he was writing his book, were familiar to any English speaker, any Anglophone. But for the Chinese, it was almost impossible to translate because they had no such concept. Even when he mentioned fortune cookies, which you would think would be a Chinese thing, the mainland Chinese have no idea. What do you mean fortune cookies? They don't have them. That's a phenomenon of the Chinese diaspora. Usually Cantonese restaurants in Chinatown invented these things called fortune cookies. So we had to. But that was quite part of the fun because, Doug insisted, don't just translate things literally, so find another example if this doesn't work. Or, for example, there was the book has dialogues, kind of clever and humorous dialogues. And one of the characters says, wow, speak of the devil, meaning speak of the devil and the devil arrives, right? And so they had translated this as shuo gui, zhou lai gui, or something like that. And I said, but you have in Chinese, you say shuo cao 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 zhou zhou dao, right? And I said, that's, you speak of Cao Cao, the general, it's the same meaning exactly. You mention Cao Cao and he comes, right? I said, you should use that because this is not a very idiomatic thing. And this was the start of many arguments because they had a very fixed idea of translation. They said, no, we can't do that because we want to be faithful to the original. We want to, give the flavor of the English and all this thing, and I said, no, Doug doesn't believe in that. He says, these are just examples and you don't want to be thinking, what? Oh, yeah, I guess Americans can say that. You don't want the reader having to take a lesson in American culture. It should just read fluidly and easily, and you say, oh, 说早早早就到, right? So this was the process that we were going through. They had translated puns literally and then put footnotes to explain the joke.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the time was not actually just translating, but actually what we call trans-conceptualizing, to take a joke or an issue in something and clothe it in the Chinese language, which is cause for some change and some shifting of concepts. But the idea is to get across the idea in idiomatic Chinese. But they finally came along with it and agreed and said, yeah, this is a good working methodology because this way we don't have to have tortured footnotes and things and make it fun to read for Chinese people. And I think that's part of its success. We had other problems too with the publisher because he had such a thing as characters and letters turned upside down. And this commercial press was one of the most famous presses in China. And we took this manuscript to them and said, what are you talking about? We can't print characters upside down. Why would we want to do that? But it was part of the joke or the pun, By the way, I think that Gödel, Escher, Bach, the translation, was actually the first computer typeset book to be published in China. So I think commercial press, it was hard on them because they were doing a new way of typesetting and printing a book, which is to get it in computer and then print it out. So maybe we lost a year or more, maybe even 2 years with kind of trying to figure out how commercial press could do this book.
So you're saying previously when they had printed something, they'd position the individual blocks for each of the characters and physically press down?
Yeah, right. Now, they didn't have computer typesetting. It was there long ago. Maybe, I don't know when it came in, the 70s, 60s, 70s, I'm not sure. Not for China, right? So yeah, China, it was an important phase, and it was a great period to be there because the reform and opening up was already in its 10th year or its 7th or 8th, 9th year. People were so excited and so curious and so willing, to read books like this. The famous novel, 100 Years of Solitude, I think there were 5 different translations of that book, and people just ate it up. So it was a wonderful time. The intelligentsia felt liberated. You could actually go overseas. And this book was kind of there in the middle of it for me. I was concentrating on this translation, but I was also learning about China. I was totally ignorant about Chinese culture mostly. I mean, I knew some basic things, But so it was a kind of a learning experience for me, not just about translation and linguistics, but also, China, and a great honor to meet these young Peking University master's students who were very intelligent and very, very obsessed with the West. The biggest fights we had was which language are we going to speak? Because they wanted to speak English and improve their English, and I wanted to speak Chinese and speak Chinese. So we had fights about that. They usually won because their English was much better than my Chinese, but still.
I'm curious, while you were translating GEB, I mean, the book itself, a lot of it is about the topic of translation, and like actually self-reference is a theme of the book. Like, so while you were translating, did that strike you as like really trippy? Like, did you like learn things about translation in the act of translating it?
Yeah, absolutely. He has a whole chapter there about translation. In the original version, he had 3 versions of Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky, which has nonsense words in it, right? And so that chapter was about, meaning and how meaning corresponds with the written word and so forth, right? So he had these examples of the original and then these 2 different translations, German and French. So how would you translate words like, the garrulous Bandersnatch, or these sorts of nonsense words, Because the idea he was saying, these are not just nonsense. They cause some kind of vague semantic content to rise in your brain, and you can't quite explain it. There's the sounds, there's the relationship with cognates and spelling and something like that. So these things are not, they're not nonsense. Mm-hmm. And yet they're not actually directly translatable. So how do you do it? And so since we were doing this book in Chinese, he added a 4th translation, which was Zhao Yanren's translation of Alice in Wonderland and the Jabberwock, right? Which was very interesting because that added yet a new chapter in that translation, because we had to actually do the same thing in this particular version that those other 2 translators had done with Lewis Carroll in French and German. We luckily had, here's the way they did it in French, here's the way they did it in German. Now, how do we do it in Chinese, right? So the problem with Chinese is, if you're going to translate to have a different word, a nonsense word, probably it means you're going to have to create a character to do that, right? But since there isn't a default sort of phonetic representation for that character, you might have to guess, like, how would you do that? Because the French version, you can read it aloud and you can get the same feeling as reading the English, right? I'll just do the one that Zhao Yanren did, some really clever translations, but he made up some characters. So the very first one was "'twas brillig," something. Lewis Carroll left a hint to that brillig was the daytime, the time for boiling food or something like that. So the brillig was kind of a sort of a collapsed word of brilliant maybe and boiling or something like that, right? So what Zhao Yanren did was he just took the character "by," meaning white, which is a very common word, and he just put the 4 dots of the fire radical below it. And he said, I think most Chinese who read this would probably understand this to be the most common structure for Chinese characters, which is a radical, which gives you a meaning, and then another component that gives you a clue to the sound. So most Chinese would probably say, that must be "by." But it has the fire radical, so it must be something about burning and fire and white and brilliance or something like that, right? So that's just an example where he used the special aspects of Chinese to come up with something that might evoke, quote unquote, the same thing in the mind of the reader, of the Chinese reader. Something that's vague and weird and unusual. The Chinese reader will say, what's this? I don't know this word. In the same way that the English speaker, I don't know what this brillig means. But it has enough phonetic information to give you a little bit of semantic hint. And so we had a great time, comparing this. And I think Doug even added some more text to talk about the Zhao Yanren translation, which, by the way, Zhao Yanren translated all of Alice in Wonderland. And I think it was one of the first books to be actually written in Baihua, in the vernacular in China, which is kind of funny that the very first book written in the vernacular would be a Lewis Carroll book full of nonsense and whimsical humor. It's just kind of wonderful. But anyway, yeah, that sort of thing happened all the time, that we had to talk about how do we get the same idea in the mind of the Chinese reader without just explaining it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was going to ask how much was lost, but it seems like a lot was actually gained, just basically creating new things from scratch to match the underlying concepts.
Right. I mean, the whole thing was, when you change something, you can't just change it and you make it literal. You have to just accept. This is the idea. It's like for any translator, even if it's ordinary translation, the question is, does this evoke the same thought or trigger the same image in the mind of the reader reading in translation as in the original text? Is it ever that way? Writing poetry, can you ever recreate the kinds of semantic world, semantic meanings that the original made? All you can do is get close. All you can get is, sometimes you can find the exact parallel, but most of the time you're just trying to find something that works. And so, yeah, this is the kind of thing we were faced with constantly. Like, how do we make this joke? And most of our time actually was kind of fun. We were like sitting around together, making jokes, trying to see. And of course, it was also great that we were in China doing it, because we could write something and then we could just show it to the dorm room guy next door, right? Does this make sense? Is this funny? Do you get it? This kind of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, that must have been like, one of the most unique and intense kind of like Chinese learning methods available, like possible, right? Just having to translate something like that with a whole team of people. Yeah, that's amazing. From that time till now, there's been an enormous increase in kind of the economic standards of the average person. And people at the time when you arrived, I imagine they were pretty self-aware that it was a period of reform and opening up.
Yeah, it was a very optimistic time, obviously, because, to call it opening up is almost, not strong enough. It was an absolute eruption of cross-cultural interaction and just enormous passion and curiosity. It was a time in which nearly every week or something you would have some new New York Times headline saying, guess what? China now has X, whatever it happens to be, right? So China now has Coca-Cola. Wow, amazing. China now has, commercial banks. Oh, and so on and so forth. Everyone was sort of exhilarated by these changes. Professors were now able to go abroad. The students themselves were able to hold meetings. They had these, what they called shalong, which was a translation of salons, like intellectual salons. And on the campus, they would have these salons, and they would do poetry readings. They would talk about democracy. This was like a kind of an echo of the May 4th movement, because they saw it as yet another turning point where they had a chance to actually reform China very comprehensively. And some of the same issues were still there, especially democracy was in the air. And you had people like Fang Lizhi, who's a physicist, who would give talks to students about democracy. And strangely enough, the government, because they had softened on the economical aspect, Deng Xiaoping was also willing to give more leeway to have a sort of public voice and talk about more deep reforms, not just in the economic sphere, but also in the political and economic and sort of the spiritual sphere. People were looking for, a spiritual kind of life, that's something that they could occupy the mind and soul rather than just politics and the Little Red Book.
That's really interesting, because I knew that this was a time of upheaval, but I thought people would be more excited about Coca-Cola or like televisions or buying an automobile than intellectual ideas or the spiritual fulfillment.
Well, you're not wrong. People were obsessed with automobiles and TV sets. I remember my aunt. I have a Chinese aunt, and she really wanted to buy a TV, and it had to be a color TV. The Prestige, and she actually sort of illegally tried to do a money change with some Xinjiangese. She was going to give them, because these things, to buy a TV set, you couldn't use renminbi. You had to use this foreign currency that they called Waihuijuar, the foreign currency. So you had to like make a deal, give these money changers 4,000 renminbi for 3,000 or 2,500 worth of foreign currency, and then you could go buy your TV, right? And so she did this deal, and she turned out to be, she was cheated by them. And when she got to the store, she realized that she only had half the money that she was bargaining for. But she went back, and she had to have a color TV because that was no black and white, color. She wanted to have the latest thing. Yes, McDonald's came in later on, and all sorts of things were going in. People loved it, and some of it was strange, but kids are very malleable and they quickly caught on. So and clothing styles and rock and roll. You had Sui Jian, this rock and roll player, rock and roll singer, things like this. So people, it was more than just, I don't think you can separate the material rise of standard of living and the spiritual. I think they both go hand in hand. You have to have enough to eat and security and a way to get around and to be able to actually have a certain freedom to travel and freedom to explore things and buy things. Coming with that, I guess, is you can think about other things, but just mere subsistence.
Well, to get an idea of what it was like, was it actually commonplace for people to go hungry because of economic conditions?
Oh, yeah. Going outside of Beijing, you could see it. Really, massive poverty. And even in Beijing, you would see what people are living on. They still had rations. They could only have meat, several times a week. It was nothing like it is now. Peking University, right now, if you go to Peking University, surrounding it are all kinds of high rises and, a very urban sort of area. But Peking University at that point was way out in the boondocks. When you left campus, it was in the countryside practically. I would go off the East Gate riding my bicycle. One night I rode out of the campus on my bicycle and just kind of got lost, and I fell into a pit. There were pig farmers there. I fell into a pit that was filled with feces. And I don't even know if it was pig feces or human feces. I'm not sure. But I had to get up and ride back to the campus. And I got to my dorm. And the guy at the gate said, "No, you can't come in. you've got shit all over your body. What do you?" And he had to get a hose and hose me down, But that was a reminder of how, just one step away from the university, you saw some very, very, very Qing dynasty level of poverty. It was a stark contrast between the people in the urban areas and in the countryside.
When you say rations, people, so people purchased food with government vouchers. Is that how it worked? Or
Yeah,
it wasn't a market system.
They were coupons. So the Danwei system was still there, although it was beginning.
Can you explain the Danwei system?
Yeah. So the way that the Chinese economic world was structured after Mao was these work units. Everyone had to belong to a work unit. These were not like capitalist companies. They were actually production units. Basically, you didn't have much choice. They would put you in a job category based upon your background or your abilities or your gender. They were making steel. They were making chairs, all these different things that the country needed. But in these enormous factories, these Danweis, and that a Danwei could be as much as 1 million people. And that was your identity. So if you traveled to another city and check into a hotel, they wouldn't even ask you your name. They'd just say, "What's your Danwei?" So this Danwei system was kind of like a cradle to grave sort of situation for the workers, because they provided your clothing, they provided your kids' education, they had canteens where you ate, and if you died, they would bury you. Your cradle to grave, you belong to the Danwei, right?
So it's the same word that they use nowadays to refer to the company you work for, right? Like if you work for Huawei, that would be your Danwei.
They will still use that, yeah. It literally means unit. You need a Danwei. Much less nowadays, people are just saying need a gongsi or something like. But yeah, Danwei is kind of a typical slang term for the place where I work. So that was the way that the economic system was structured. So when I was there, people were leaving the Danwei. They call it jumping into the sea. 下海, right, to go into business, which was a risk because once you're out of the Danwei system and you go broke, you don't have money, you don't have a place to live. So, but people were being encouraged to go ahead and go out and be entrepreneurs and build China's. So you would see, it used to be that the only place you could get a haircut is at your Danwei. But people, entrepreneurs begin to say, everyone hates those haircuts. I can open a barber shop and do it much better, and people pay a little more money. And so they would try that, and of course it worked, especially for, female salons that want to make their hair prettier and stuff like that. And restaurants, there weren't that many restaurants just open to the public. There were some, enough. But most people ate at their canteen. So you began to see the restaurants arise and compete with each other. So the food became better and better, and they had supply lines. So we were seeing the beginnings, the inchoate beginnings of capitalism.
So the thing that allowed this to happen? I mean, I assume that people had renminbi the whole time, but it was just that they were finally permitted to open their own businesses, right? Like legally.
Right. And it was what Deng Xiaoping described as crossing the river by feeling the stones. I have to mention, Deng Xiaoping was a bit of a genius in carrying out this reform and opening up because he was smart enough to realize that no one was smart enough to figure this out. There was just no way you could, China was a 5-year plan type of country. We planned for the next 5 years. And he realized 5-year plans won't work because, a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and it's totally different. So he said, Moser shi dou guo he, cross the river by feeling the stones. So they would try out something, and if it worked, then they would approve it and go ahead and keep on developing it. If it didn't work, then we would cancel it and go on to something else, right? Which was these special economic zones. They would try and get a certain foreign Chinese joint venture going and seeing what works, what kind of format works, how much money can we earn, and so forth. So I think, it was an exciting time and things were moving very fast, but Deng did a very smart thing, which was to avoid the sorts of unforeseen pitfalls that can happen with a capitalist system. Overnight, you can go bankrupt and people lose their jobs. So they're very careful to avoid that kind of catastrophe, right? So I was witnessing all this happening around me. It was very chaotic, but it was the mood at the time was just unbelievably optimistic. And I would say, even joyous. A lot of people were unhappy because some people were getting rich and some people weren't. But that was unavoidable. Most of all, people were, especially parents who now had more hope for their children. And that was a big thing.
Yeah, yeah. I want to move on to the Chinese language. So there's a notorious essay of yours. It's been circulating online for some time. It's called "Why is Chinese So Damn Hard?" And I think reading it is a cathartic experience for many Chinese learners who, they've been struggling through the language, and when they read it, they think, oh, it's not just me. It's the language is actually hard.
Yeah.
So first of all, why is Chinese so damn hard?
Well, I must preface this, though, with the fact that piece was written back in, I don't remember when, 1991 or 2 or something. I can't remember, back in the early 90s, before the advent of these digital dictionaries and Chinese learning, internet sites and such, the digital world. So if I were to write that paper today, I would just say, why Chinese is so darn hard. It's darn hard. It's not damn hard, but back then it was damn hard, right? So why is it damn hard? I mean, the first thing you just have to say, it's the characters. It's the characters, because I love the characters. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with Chinese. I thought they're beautiful, exotic, exciting. I love to look at them, learn about them, write them. But for heaven's sakes, it's the biggest stumbling block to getting into that language, because you can't say it's not phonetic, but it's so frustratingly weakly phonetic that it's almost makes you want to just wish either just make it a character, or it's.
So just to spell it out for people who don't know what we're talking about, every single word basically has to be learned by itself. So you don't have a spelling where you can refer to an alphabet, but literally every single word, like mother, father, fish, or whatever, is its own unique pictographic character.
Yeah, you could say it's orthography. It's orthography, or it's not right to say pictographs, because they're not all pictures of something. But we avoid that term just to get around that misunderstanding. But yeah, they are unique, and you have to learn them by rote. I think a way that you can understand it is, people have seen Chinese characters, but they are somewhat like the sorts of typographic we have in English, like the ampersand and the at sign and the question mark and all these different things, right? You just have to learn, or even the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the Indo-Arabic numbers. When you see the number 3, that doesn't give you any clue how to pronounce it. You just memorize it. When you see 3, it's kind of like a Chinese character. You just memorize it. Oh, that squiggle says 3, and it means 3, right? So imagine a language in which all these words are that way. They're all just squiggles that don't give much clue to how to pronounce them.
So instead of learning 26 alphabetical characters, you have to learn several thousand Chinese characters.
Right. And that's a big question too. How many thousand do you have to learn, right? So even if it's just 1,000 or 2,000 like they have in Japan, it's still hard to learn that many unique characters. And the other thing is, I guess the best way to put it is with a language like English or French, you just need certain letters of the alphabet as a code for sounds. Then you have what we call a virtuous loop. So if you can read a word and sound it out, then you can also write it, right? Because you know how it sounds, so you know how to write it. And if you know how to write it, then when you hear it, you can know what it means and you can know what it must look like on the page. So the reading and writing and listening and speaking is a virtuous loop. One reinforces the other, right? So the example I gave in my article was, when I was in France, I would hear on the radio someone selling what they called amortisseur. And I said, what's amortisseur? What would that be? And I didn't know, but I walked down the street and I saw the word amortisseur and there was a shock absorber below it. And I said, aha, amortisseur is shock absorber. And I got it. Now I can spell it, I can say it, I can understand it, and I can write it. But I'm rocking around in Taipei, and if I hear shock absorber in Chinese, I don't know what I'm hearing, right? So I have no idea how to write it. And I might bump into the characters for shock absorber, but I have no idea that it is that because I have nothing to compare it. So I have to learn everything painfully and you have to, the only way to learn it is to associate that character with pinyin, and you have to learn a whole new alphabetic phoneticization symbol system in order just to learn the characters, right?
If you had to quantify your experiences with other languages, like French, for example, like how many years would it take for you to become fluent in French versus Chinese?
Well, we have some statistics on that. Evidently, the U.S. Embassy has this program where they teach embassy people to learn foreign languages when they're stationed in different countries. And they have, I think, 3 different levels of difficulty. Easy languages are French, so-and-so. Harder language are things like Russian, which has an alphabet and everything, but it's really hard. And then the really hard one are Japanese, to some extent Korean, but China's at the top, the hardest thing to possibly learn. So I would say, from my own experience, I was able to get somewhat pretty conversational in French after just 1 year of reading, meeting French people. I think it took me about 5 years before I could even read a book in Chinese. And at the end of 5 years, I still was totally incompetent. I was not a good speaker. I was not fluent at all in Chinese. It was struggling all the time. And there's so many things like that. Just here's another example. These Indo-European languages, English, French, Italian, they're so close together. They're almost like brothers and sisters of each other. China is a totally different system. So if I'm speaking French, let's say, and somebody asks me, do you like music? Aimez-vous la musique? And I say, bien sûr. J'aime les Brahms, Bach, Tchaikovsky, and I can rattle off these composers' names, right? And they say, wow, he really knows his music. If a Chinese person answers me, do you like music? I say, 当然，我喜欢Bach, Tchaikovsky. Do you understand? I don't know. I can't say any of these names. So I have to learn them from scratch. So all of these things are hurdles. What it means is to say is it takes years and years to get to the stage where you're able to even read any book at a reasonable level. I would say roughly, now this is back in the old days. I think it's much easier now. Back then, I would say the ratio is like 1 to 5. It would take me 5 years to get as fluent in Chinese as it would be for the 1 year in French. And I think that's not an exaggeration.
Yeah, that makes sense. But there is this idea that the spoken language is actually the essence of language, whereas the writing is just an afterthought, and it merely is a recording of the spoken language. If you were to accept that, if you just had somebody who was not trying to become literate, but trying to become conversationally fluent, then Chinese wouldn't actually be that hard, right?
Yes, you're exactly right. I'm glad you mentioned this. The linguist who came up with this opinion is Moser. He said the basis of speech is speaking and listening, right? And that's true of all languages. China is not an exception to that at all. And as we know, for thousands of years, people spoke Chinese all the time, and most of them were not able to write it or read it, right? So yeah, I would say the core of language is speaking. The problem is Chinese characters block that. that natural sort of, as I said, this virtuous loop. This has implications for learners of Chinese. So I was a learner of Chinese, and I went the route of trying to do both, which is trying to get the characters and the reading and the speaking all together. So I was tackling all of those. But it's not a naive or a stupid thing to do to say, to hell with the characters, I don't even want to mess with them. I just want to learn to speak Chinese. And a lot of foreigners just make that decision. And it's not a bad one. It depends on what your needs are or what your goals are. I guess I should tell you that I think we're on the cusp of a sort of revolution in the way we teach Chinese, because the old-fashioned notion was among Chinese teachers that, oh, you have to read the Chinese characters in order to speak it, and you have to write them because that's the only way you can memorize them. Well, those are both wrong. You can recognize Chinese characters without knowing how to write them. Just like you can look at a treble clef, on the music staff, and you say, oh, that's a treble clef, but very few people could write it. So the same thing with Chinese characters. And the same thing with speaking. You can learn it without ever looking at Chinese text. The problem is that if you want to learn esoteric vocabulary, something you wouldn't be necessarily speaking about or hearing about, then if you're going to use Chinese, you've got to delve into it and get a textbook and a dictionary and figure out what they're trying to say. But I think as a strategy for learners, it depends on what you want to do. If you're a business person or you want to just belong to a soccer team or a rock band, you probably should just forget all that and just ask, how do I say this? How do I say that? How do I say that? Write it down in pinyin or just remember it. Very quickly, just like when you speak French, you'll very quickly be able to converse and remember sorts of things. If you add on to that all this character writing and everything, it's going to prolong your learning process for years. So this revolution I'm talking about is the teachers usually would say, you have to learn 50 characters a week. And we take this Tingxie test where you have to memorize them, and then we give you a dictation and you have to write the characters, right? Well, every student who's ever taken Chinese hates that, because, especially the beginners, said, I learned these 50 characters, I take the test, and a week later I've forgotten them all. I might be able to recognize them, but I can't write them, And yet every week I have another 50 characters that I will forget. And people say it's a waste of time. It's a waste of valuable time, because especially nowadays in the digital age where you will never be asked to write by hand for any reason. If you're going to write Chinese, you're going to do it on a word processor, right? So what is this silly requirement for have students to be writing characters that even the Chinese themselves are forgetting how to write? So I think the new thing is characters, learn about 100 characters so you understand the basic structure and how to write them. And then after that, you're on your own. Learn to read, of course, but you don't need to learn to write to read, and do other things. Do things that could strengthen your vocabulary and your tones, etc. And it's been resisted by a lot of the old-fashioned Chinese, fuddy-duddy, says no, there's this kind of myth, there's kind of a thing about Chinese. People tend to mystify the Chinese characters as if they're magical in some ways, that they can communicate deep meanings that mere alphabets can't. And there is some point to that. They're very semiotic. There's a lot of information in the Chinese character, but it's cultural information. It's not really semantic information. And they're beautiful, so they're artistic and very aesthetic. But I think people have this, oh no, if you can't read and write Chinese, you don't really know Chinese. And it's false, and we've caused so many of my students gave up after a year or two. I have so many students that say, "This is too hard. I just can't do it," and they give up. And I think that we're now realizing, don't put them through this. Let them explore characters if they want, but as you say, speak and listen. Those are the two things, right? So I think things are getting better, and it's going to make Chinese not so damn hard.
So one of the things you talk about in your book is that the idea that there is such a thing as a Chinese language, it's a bit of a political fiction, a piece of propaganda. So there's actually a group of Chinese languages, and they're as different from each other as like French and Italian. So for example, the local version of Chinese spoken in Shanghai would be completely unintelligible to somebody from Beijing who only knew that dialect, and vice versa. What's really interesting about your book is that you wrote, it wasn't necessarily a foregone conclusion that the national language would be this northern dialect called Mandarin. And it could very well have been Shanghainese or Cantonese or a hybrid of either of those two with each other or with Mandarin. How plausible, first of all, was it that they could have gone with something else?
Yeah, that's kind of the crux of my book, right? So the background was that the end of the Qing dynasty, 1912 or whenever it was, and now they have a country there that's basically the size of the Qing dynasty, the expanse of it, and they want to create a country, right? So they need a language, because that's, look at European, you have one country, one people, one language. So what would that language be? Yeah, China never had a language that everyone spoke, and it caused great problems for the ruling class because people from provinces would come to Beijing to meet the emperor, converse with the various people they wanted to do dealings with. They couldn't understand each other. They couldn't speak their same language. So they came up with a kind of artificial language that was kind of based on Northern Mandarin, but that tried to adhere to a certain kind of pronunciation that would make it at least understandable. And that's where our word Mandarin comes from, because Mandarin means language of the officials. So it wasn't really a national language because only these emissaries from the provinces were required to speak it, right? So they couldn't use that, but they had to come up with something. It was such a big issue that in 1913, just a year later, they had this big meeting in Beijing. You can still see the building that they had the meeting in. And they said, what language are going to make the national language? And you had factions. There were people from the south that said, well, our languages are better, more beautiful. The Guangdong contingent could say, look, we're the language of international trade, because most of the Chinese going out were using Cantonese, right? And of course, the northern people said, hey, our dialect has more speakers than yours does. And it does. The Northern Mandarin is by far the greatest number of speakers of that language, right? So to make a long story short, they couldn't decide on how to deal with this. So they came up with a compromise. They said, let's come up with a kind of a Frankenstein version. We have some aspects of the northern language and some aspects of the southern language. So they basically based it on most of the sort of the northern dialects with some of the another tone that was called the rusheng. We have 4 tones in Chinese, but this is a different one that is in Cantonese, and it's a stop tone. For example, in Mandarin or in Putonghua, the name for McDonald's is Mai Dang Lao, right? But in Cantonese is Mak Deng Lo. Mak has a k at the end, right? So Putonghua doesn't have stops at the end, like yut. But Cantonese does, right? So it says we want to include these stops on the certain categories that would normally have in Cantonese would have these stops at the end, right? So they put that in, and there are other things too complicated to explain easily. But
is that Russian actually present in the language that they eventually came up with?
Yes, the original one, right? This Frankensteinian thing they came up with was not the final version. So here's the story, right? So they codified this thing, and they had 6,000 different characters, right? And they had the proper pronunciation for each one of them. And so they said, all right, we can now teach this. And phonograph records was a technology that existed. So we need to find someone to take these phonograph records and record all the sounds of the new dialect, right? The common language, right? So they got this guy named Wang Pu, and he couldn't do it because he was Beijinger and he couldn't get these sounds. They were totally, he just couldn't do it because his ear wasn't good enough. So he said, oh dear, what are you going to do? So they found this guy named Zhao Yanren, who was a linguistic genius. He spoke many different dialects, had a very good ear, and he could do it. I mean, his ear was so good, he could do things like, he could speak backwards English, where all the phonemes, so go, and then reverse the tape, and it would sound like, hello, how are you, in English. So he had this amazing, ear. So he went to New York City, to Columbia Records, and spent several days recording all the sounds of the Guoyu, they called it, the national language, and brought it back to China. They said, great, success. Now let's start teaching it. But then they realized, hold on a minute, who's going to teach this to the kids? Because none of the teachers can pronounce those sounds, which seems like a blunder of enormous implications. It's like, we got this thing after all this discussion, and it's worthless. Nobody's going to be able to learn this. So Zhao Yanren actually said, for several years, he said, I was the only native speaker of this idiolect that was meant to be spoken by 600 million people. I was the only speaker of the common language, which is true. So what happened then is the war intervened and they put it aside. And when they convened later to be serious about it, they did the right thing. They said, all right, let's just make the sounds Beijing dialect, the Beijing language. Let's make that the phonetic system. And then all the other things, the vocabulary and other matters we can deal with, right? So that's what they did. But the thing to when you say the current common language in China is called 普通话, it's not that different from the 国语 that Chiang Kai-shek had come up with, but it's 普通话. 普通话, and here's the thing that people need to understand. 普通话 is not Beijing Hua. It's not just the Beijing dialect.
Yeah, why didn't they just make it the Beijing dialect? I mean, it's very close, right?
It's very close in its core, yeah, just especially in the pronunciation. But even in Beijing, there were different variations, right? The problem was there were too many slangs, too many things that were so indigenous to Beijing that it would be very difficult to make it comprehensive throughout the country. Beijing dialect, being a northern dialect, has much more in common with these huge amount of northern dialect regional speech types, that it would be much easier to use another criteria for the vocabulary. So it was the Beijing dialect for the phonetics and the northern dialects for the vocabulary, right?
So it'd be like a strip down, because just what was common among the dialects, right? You'd remove local variation.
Right. So for example, what do you call your paternal grandfather? And there were different ones all throughout, but at least in the majority of the northern dialects would have the same word with a different pronunciation, right? And household utensils, how do you say spoon? How do you say chopstick? When they look at the northern dialects, basically had most of those things in common. So we're not going to just use Beijing dialect. We're going to use what's statistically sort of more common in the northern dialects. The last thing is for a grammar and for like polite, sort of correct dictation and stuff, they used the Baihua, the modern, idiom of books, fiction and technical books and stuff that were written in the new Baihua. Most books were always written in classical Chinese, which was not a native language of any of them. It was an artificial language among the elites. But then they said, let's quit printing books in classical Chinese. Let's print it in the vernacular. So it was the first time you had actually books that just were written the way people speak. So they said, let's take the literary standards and styles from these Baihua books and have that be the standard for correct grammar and correct dictation. So it's also interesting because China has never really thought of having a common language be simply a record of speech. When we say, what is French? It's the way that French people speak on the street. Chinese linguists always wanted to say, no, the language has to be elegant. So we can't just use any street argot. We have to use something that's beautiful. So they still want to sort of go to these novels and books as a kind of standard of beauty and elegance of the Chinese language. So there's still not just a descriptive, but kind of a prescriptive aspect to it, right? So it's kind of a vague definition, but that's the definition of what we now call 普通话.
The Beijing dialect, I mean, the thing that's notable about it is like the sounds at the ends of words, right? And maybe it's just notable because that's the main thing that differs from 普通话. If 普通话was based on Beijing dialect, why did they get rid of that specific feature?
I'm not sure that they did. There are rules for the erhua, and sometimes people overuse it. But no, there are certain words that are standard that have to have the erhua. So they've regulated the erhua. And so nowadays, if you're in the 普通话 books, there are words that have to have a.
So I guess it's just less common in 普通话than in Beijing dialect.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of differences. By the way, the 国语 that they speak in Taiwan is kind of from the Chiang Kai-shek era, and they don't actually include erhua in the R, and they also don't things like your family names, father's. Baba. The first one has a fourth tone. The next one is a neutral tone. Baba, mama. In Taiwan, they will say mama, and they don't have all the R's. But if you look at a 普通话, textbook or something, you'll get 电影 for movie 电影. You can say 电影, but that's just an option. A lot of erhua is just optional. You can put it in or you can't.
During this time of where, everything was on the table in terms of what people were willing to change about the Chinese language, there were some pretty serious discussions to just completely get rid of the characters in favor of a romanization. And obviously, we did end up with a romanization, pinyin, but that's just used for pedagogical purposes. So is it actually possible to use pinyin as the sole form of written Chinese? Is that feasible, or is there something unworkable about it, fundamentally unworkable about it?
It's theoretically feasible. People like Victor Mayer, the University of Pennsylvania, has actually printed books all in pinyin, and they're perfectly readable if it's ordinary speech. What's interesting is that because it's just a language, right? Like any language. So a lot of Chinese will tell you, they said, "Oh, I can't read pinyin. I have to have the characters. Otherwise, I don't understand what it's saying with pinyin." If you ask them the question, if I took this book and read it to you out loud, would you be able to understand it? They said, well, of course. That's all pinyin is. It's reading the book out loud for you, right? Now, Chinese people are not used to doing that. They just are not used to reading pinyin for recreation or just to get the basic information. They can pronounce pinyin, but they can't fluently they struggle with reading pinyin texts. But if you spent your whole life only reading pinyin text, you would have absolutely no problem with it. And you wouldn't have to worry about it, right? So that's the thing. But there's a little bit of a problem, which is because current vernacular contemporary Chinese still has this tendency to go back to the ancient language, to the classical language. So there are idioms, there are four-character idioms, there are phrases or sort of standard sorts of slang or something that go back that are really incomprehensible unless you know the reference or know the sort of milieu that it came from reading lots, right? Because Chinese writers are writing in Chinese with characters, they often fall back or even put an entire sentence in classical Chinese, knowing full well that the people who will be reading it will be able to decipher it because they can look at the characters. Things like that translated into pinyin wouldn't work because suddenly you don't know what these characters are, what the characters should be. So if China had decided to go via pinyin, then I think we would have by now we could have solved all these problems. I mean, I can imagine technical books that have to do with Chinese history could be all in pinyin, but when a classical allusion or a classical sentence had to be inserted, you just insert the characters because anyone reading that would already know that and would be able to figure it out, right? So we could have kids reading pinyin and with no problem whatsoever. It's just a matter of what you're used to. A lot of people say, though, and I agree, that it would be a cultural tragedy if they were to eliminate the characters because it's more than just a writing system. It's more than just a sound. So imagine that we eliminated all the characters. The sort of romance and the flavor of people's names would go away. Because if you're Wang Li or Wang Li or whatever the Li is, there are a million different things you can, and they're all different. They all mean something different, right? But unfortunately, in pinyin, it would all be just the same boring letters. And we'd have the problem we have here in English, which is my name is David. Well, what does that name mean? I don't know. I don't know what it means. Doesn't mean anything. It's just a name, right? And China would fall back on that. It was just a name. Was Xing Mao. What does that mean? I don't know. It's just a surname, right? So there's a Chinese saying, 有失有得. When you get something, you have to lose something. So if we make universal literacy, much easier, you're going to lose a lot of cultural value. You just will. If we keep the characters, then we have all this wonderful cultural semiotic value, historical content. But you have poor kids struggling all through grade school and high school to learn these characters, right? So it's a trade-off, which is important and which isn't. To the credit of the educational sector, they're changing their attitudes towards that as well. One problem with grade school kids, they're still learning characters even into high school. They say China has 98% literacy, but at the cost of what? It takes them 10 or more years to get fluent in the writing system because there's so many characters they have to learn, right? But there's been a problem that, children, when you say, write an essay about your mother or something, they get stuck with a character they can't remember. And so they stop their flow of thought while they have to think about this character. And they maybe will change what they were going to write because they can't remember, so they'll just choose another adjective. And we said, that's not the way we don't want to make our kids unable to have a coherent flow of thought that they can render on the page. So nowadays in grade schools, they're saying, if you can't remember a character, just write the pinyin with the proper tone so that their thought process can continue fluidly, right? And I think that's great. And, with all these digital tools now, I mean, the problems are getting soluble. But I think pre-digital age, it was really problematic, not only for we foreign learners, but for the Chinese people themselves. It was a problem that they had to solve. And the problem is usually solved by lots and lots of rigid rote learning, hours and hours and hours of it.
Yeah, yeah. So the simplification that actually occurred was simplification of the characters. So now the characters that people on the mainland use are a simplified form of those used traditionally and still to this day in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I was surprised somewhere you wrote that it only yielded a reduction of 12.5% in the number of strokes for the most common words. Mm-hmm. And I was pretty surprised by how paltry that is, right? And so you don't really gain that much at the cost of this divergence between the Chinese characters written in different parts of the world. So do you feel like that was a mistake, given how little we've gotten from it?
Probably that 12.5%, you have to think about what it actually means. If you're saying the reduction in the overall character set of 12.5%, it sounds kind of paltry. But when you look at just, let's say, the most common 50 characters, then if you look at some of the traditional ones with like 10 strokes, things like that, they're so common, you're writing them every day. I think the reduction, the convenience is more than just 12.5% really in actual sense. So it's when you write it, you really feel it, because you can zoom through with these simplifications, which are ugly, by the way, but that's what the price you pay. You can't. So, was it worth it or not? Interestingly, Taiwan and then mainland China both claim that they have literacy rates of something like 97%. Now, that would tell you that the Taiwanese, who are still using the Fanti, so the very complicated characters, are just as literate as the mainlanders, right? Now, what it means, I don't know. It's very complicated. The Taiwan population is very different than the total of the 1.4 billion, many of them in the countryside. I mean, these statistics just mean nothing. And also, they don't really mean much because the very definition of literacy is a little bit dumbed down for China. It's more like the definition of literacy is you have to know 2,000 characters and be able to write and recognize them. Well, people say for a literate reader to read a novel, you probably need more like 5,000 characters to actually be able to read a very information-rich book. But for newspaper or just, magazine, yeah, probably 2,000 characters. All of Chairman Mao's works can be written with just 2,000 characters because he didn't care about disco or rock and roll. So he only wrote about politics. My feeling is, oh yeah, it's a godsend. I started out learning the complicated characters, and I thought, boy, this is ridiculous. I have to mention this, though, which was what's one of my main sort of research projects right now, is the problem of 提笔忘字, character amnesia, we call it. Chinese people forgetting to write certain characters, right? And I noticed this way back when I was at Peking University, maybe back then in the 80s, I can't remember. Sat down with 2-3 friends, all 3 in the Chinese department, one from Hong Kong, and the other 2 at Beijing, Chinese department. And I wanted to write a little note to somebody saying, I can't meet you today, I have a cold, I'm sneezing, and I wanted to write the word sneeze in Chinese. And I didn't know how to write it. So I asked these 3 PhD students, can you tell me how to write the character for sneeze? And they just shrugged. None of them could write it. And this struck me. There's my first awareness of this character amnesia problem, that here are 3 elite Chinese students at the Harvard of China, and they can't write sneeze in their native language. Can you imagine me going to Harvard and asking 3 English majors how to write sneeze or anything, abracadabra, kneecap, anything? They could write anything, right? And I realized there is this problem. And, it was already a problem. People would have to say, hey, how do you write that character? Or they go to the dictionary, or they guess, or they just write a scribble that looks like it. But when the digital tools arrived, the internet, and, people started writing only on word processors, it's gotten worse. I mean, it's got into crisis mode. I mean, people are really, really forgetting really common characters. They can read them with no problem, but they can't write them. And the Chinese education department had this panic that, this is terrible. This is a crucial part of our culture. We can't let this go. And so they put these TV shows on, to sort of game shows, to show young kids, to have young kids compete in their character writing.
Like a spelling bee.
Yeah, exactly, like a spelling bee. And you had judges there, the kids were all smart and everything. And so they would give them, a word, and then they'd have the clock ticking 10 seconds, tick, tick, tick. The audience bated breath, waiting, and then they write. If they write the wrong thing, the audience goes, it's like TV, dramatic TV, and the kids that can't write a character cry and go off stage and everything. And the idea was to make school kids think, yeah, it's cool to know a lot of characters. I'm going to really, but really all it accomplished was just make people realize how bad the situation already was. That people can't write a word like frog or toad or something like that. If you look at the lists of things they missed, there are a lot of very common words they couldn't write. So I think they've abandoned that effort. Those shows are off the air and they're not doing them again. So I think this is one of those topics that in the media it's not a hot topic. Everyone will agree that it's a problem, and they all will agree that I can't write anymore, but they're not really upset about it. Anyway, this ties in back to learning Chinese as a second language. It really has to make us rethink: do we really want our foreigners to be spending every class period writing 50 characters? You're better off teaching them how to use a word processor. How do you enter Chinese and make efficiently on a word processor? And in the future, it's very likely we won't even be typing. We already have speech to text, and I use it on my WeChat all the time. So why write? Why ever write? So we're on a cusp of a very new kind of era, AI era. And again, this may just be one of those things that has to go away. When we got calculators, the slide rule became irrelevant. And I think we're on the cusp of that. In the future, it won't be important to really be able to write everything that you say in Chinese. No one will be able to, and no one will bemoan it, because the advantage of the communicative advantage is so great with these technologies. But I can understand why the traditionalists are just apoplectic about this, because there is a deep feeling, even Chinese who realize this, and even modern Chinese who who never write by hand, they will still tell you that, the characters are so part of our identity, our cultural identity. We have to keep them, and we have to learn about them. People are increasingly interested in calligraphy. That's great, but that's not the same thing as just writing in everyday life, right? So I don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 years, but you can see the writing on the wall. No pun intended. This is going to be a real change the way we read and write and learn to speak and read.
Yeah. I can see how it's very disconcerting, but at the same time, rationally, it probably doesn't really matter. So we were talking about the Chinese education system. You've experienced both the American and the Chinese educational systems as a student, as a professor. So are there any qualities that are better inculcated by one system over the other? I mean, obviously there are these tropes about creativity or willingness to work hard. Do you see any kind of systematic differences in the students that you teach from either background?
Yeah, this is a huge question that comes up again and again for a long time, I think. And people have studied this more than I have and have a lot to say about it. I would say that the stereotype that Chinese students, are more focused on rote learning, on performance rather than understanding and so forth. Whereas Westerners, excel more in creativity and self-actualization, all these kinds of things. I think those are stereotypes, but like a lot of stereotypes, they have some truth. There's a guy named Howard Gardner that wrote a book called To Merge Minds or something. I can't remember. But he was looking at he spent time in China. And the example he gave was, if you want to teach a young child in China how to use a key to open a door, then you'll put the key in the Chinese kid's hand, hold it, and push the key into the doorknob and turn it, and so the kid can get a sense of how it works. You take it out and you do it. See, put it in, turn it, and the door opens. And then the kid's already done it with the help of the parents. And you say, now you can do it, and he gains mastery really quick. And he says, wow, I can open a door now, right? He said the American parents would be a lot more likely to put the key in the kid's hand and say, here, try to open the door. And the kid might struggle a little bit, get it upside down, turn it to the left instead of the right or whatever. But finally he struggles a bit and then he gets it. and they applaud. Yay! Okay. So his point is the Chinese child has learned how to open a door. The American kid has learned general problem solving, how to solve a similar problem when you don't know how it works, right? Now that's again a kind of a stereotype, but I think there's a point to that. That is a marked difference. I've taught young children. I've taught not full time, but I've given classes to grade school kids and high school kids, and then of course college kids, including masters. And there is something to that. The younger kids, for example, are very comfortable in a collective setting where they're all doing the same thing, and they're less confident in the classroom for an individual interaction. And it's very obvious if you're an English teacher, any English teacher in China will tell you this. If you recite an English phrase and you make the kids repeat it, you'll say, "Today I went to the park to see my mother," and they will answer at the top of their voice, "I went to the park today to see my mother," and and you say, "All right, little Hongwen, you say it by yourself," and they freeze, even though you saw them just saying it at the top of their lungs and they said it very well. They're afraid. They won't answer you. They look at and that's a little weird from our standpoint. It says that, kids, we let them do all these things as long as they have the backup with everyone doing the same thing. They feel like that. They feel comfortable with that. They don't feel comfortable having the spotlight on them. And although that doesn't happen in college level, I think there's a kind of a piece of that there, right? They are happy to write a thesis or a paper on something that's already been really well studied and has lots and lots of references, and they go for it and they're really good at it. But if you want to come up with your own theory or do something that's a little bit more speculative, they just balk at it. They just say, I can't do that, And you see that over and over. There are pluses and minuses to both educational systems. I think the problem with the U.S. system is it goes too far in the other direction. I went through that system, and my daughter went through part of it, and I think it came away with lots and lots of goody feelings about how creative I am and how I am a good person and everything, but no actually substantive, quality or substantive abilities to use. The same thing when I had to learn new math when I was a kid. They taught us the principle of it, but then I wasn't able to do anything with it later on. They just wanted to blow my mind or something like that. So I think the U.S. takes the system too far in terms of just encouraging creativity. When I teach American students here in China, I'm sort of annoyed by the fact that I start to give a lecture, and I'm not 4 sentences in the lecture before some kid raises his hand and starts to challenge me, or does that include, and they haven't even heard my first point I haven't even made, and they're already asking questions because they're encouraged to do that. Don't just sit there, ask questions, be active. But it's too much. They need to sit there and then learn a little something, and then, and I feel like, the Chinese would never do that. I've never been in a class of Chinese that even would try to raise their hand, except after the class probably, right? So I don't know. I mean, China obviously is kicking our ass in mathematics and physics and STEM courses and stuff. But on the other hand, we have better startups, and we invented AI before they did, and they, so I don't know. Things change, and believe me, the Chinese education system, they're well aware of this issue. They're well aware of it, and there's a lot of soul searching and meetings, and different experimental schools. All at the same time, people are aware of this. People that know more about it than I do are trying to solve this issue. And I think it's really one of these things that there isn't a right or wrong answer.
You never, does it ever occur to you, I wish this part of this system were just wholesale transplanted into the other system? Does that ever occur to you as you're, going through this process of teaching?
Yeah. For example, rote learning. That's anathema in the U.S., right? When I was at Beijing Foreign Studies University, I would get up in the morning to go to class, and there were the students. That's a foreign language school, right? So the students are walking around with their books in the early morning, when other people would be jogging. They're out in the morning with their books, and they're just shouting out loud, memorizing passages from their books, trying to get the pronunciation, and they're doing it by rote. They're doing rote learning. This is it's the Lincoln at Gettysburg Address or something. They're saying it out loud over and over and over and over again. And I think that, as I said, I think it's anathema to the American approach. It's like, well, this rote learning. What's the use of that? What's the use of it? That's the Jiben Gong. That's the basic thing. They're learning pronunciation. They're learning patterns that will be a great aid to them later on, that they are subconsciously absorbing. And it's like exactly learning a musical instrument. You can't learn a song on the piano by just going through it once and say, I get it. Yeah, this goes to A, B, C, blah, blah, blah. No, you have to do it over and over and over and over a million times to learn it. And language has that quality too. But I don't see people in the US using that as a method for teaching Chinese or teaching anything. Students wouldn't put up with it.
Yeah.
They say, take this poem, Lai Li Bai, and go to your dorm room and do it 500 times, and then come back to class and recite it. They'd quit. The teacher, the other people say, what kind of teaching is that? You're just learning them rote learning. That's nothing. Come on. That's the one thing I regret, because I do know some foreigners who are pretty good at that. They can quote a whole tongue poem, I think, wow, why didn't I try that? Or I wish I had, when my mind was more, plastic and porous, and I could learn these things. It's too late for me now. I can't even remember my, what I had for lunch, So it's like, I think rote learning has a bad name, where in China it's just part of the way of the learning.
Yeah, that makes me wonder how you learn Chinese, right? Because you did it by yourself in America in a pretty short amount of time, right? Was it like 3 years before you went over to Peking University?
Well, when you said I learned it, I hadn't yet really learned it. I mean, I was in the process.
How far did you get? How far did you get by the time you landed on that flight?
So I had the De Francis books. I had a fairly good. Let's put it this way: his books were very good because, in fact, he did use kind of rote learning, but he had patterns, and you had to do these patterns over and over again, right? And I think I had some pretty good basic grammar, and I know my pronunciation was good. People had an illusion that I spoke better than I could because the tones were pretty good, and my intonation and everything, and they thought, oh, your Chinese is perfect. And then I say, huh? What did you just say?
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't as good as people thought, but I did have those two things. But I think I was so dedicated, I just came by the rote learning thing myself. I mean, I wrote characters phonetically, while watching TV or in the cab, or I just wrote Chinese characters. I kind of regret that because it didn't pay off in the 21st century, but still, I mean, it enabled me to understand it. And I had to learn how to look up characters with the Pianpeng Bushou thing, where you have to look up a radical. My students don't even know what a radical is. But I was just kind of this obsessive type. But I did one thing that was totally right, and my intuitions were completely correct. I had these books and everything, but I didn't really have the money or wherewithal to find a teacher, and I didn't want to take a Chinese class. So what I did was I got a tape recorder, and I just tape recorded Chinese people speaking. I had
conversations that you would have with Chinese people.
Yeah. Like when it was in Boston, I would go to a Chinese restaurant and I'd say to the Chinese person, you're trying to use my Chinese, 你是哪里的人 or something, and they'd say I'm from Jiangsu or something like that. And I would say they were usually sometimes exchange students or something, a part-time job. I said, would you like to come to my house to talk and drink tea? And they say, wow, great. And so they would come over and I say, can I record you? And so I used to have, hundreds of hours of just me talking to other Chinese people, and some of them were really helpful, and some of them weren't. Some of them couldn't teach at all, but I gained something. And I also got a perception of dialects, because I always thought, Chinese is just Chinese, right? You go to Boston, is a little bit of a difference, but no, I mean, I found out that Chinese dialects are really, really different, right?
So you just listen to the same few tapes over and over again? Is that is that the strategy?
Yeah, I would look up words, like he kept saying this word over and over again. What is he saying? And I'd look it up. Oh, now I get it, and then I can understand it better. So I'd listen over and over until I got a little more of it, and then go back, and I did as much as I could because because I realized, when I tried to say something, they would say, "Oh, you mean blah blah blah," and they would repeat it to me in the right way, or I would say it completely wrong, and then they'd say it right, and I needed that. I needed correction, and so I think that was the smartest thing I could have done, actually, because it was a replacement for, in just a daily encounter, no one would want to just randomly speak with me. But if I establish a relationship with them as a friend, sort of, and I did want to, and most of the time they were happy to stay in Chinese because they were tired of speaking English. He said, "Here's a guy who actually wants me to speak in my native language." So they would blab on for hours, and I wouldn't understand anything they're saying, right? But they were so happy to be using their Chinese. I also learned a great habit or great technique when listening to Chinese. Try to never reveal that you don't understand unless there's something really crucial, right? If you did, you'd be going, huh, what, sorry, what, sorry, what? You just go, I don't understand anything they're saying, right?
They'll switch to English immediately if you
exactly, yeah. They'll say, "Oh, I'm not communicating something," and believe it or not, I think that is actually a very important technique because it's a little bit cheating and it's a little bit devious, but it's the only way, because it's still that way. I mean, half the time my wife will say something and I kind of got it, but I don't want to say, "Can you say that in English?" Anyway, it's all these things I learned, but I think so I never really took a Chinese class, actually. When I went into University of Michigan, they said, well, they tested me and they said, "You could take advanced Chinese if you want, but I don't think you really need it. You can just on your own." So I didn't take a class, and I think that was the way to do it. You just talk to China, listen to what they say.
So given your own experiences learning the language and just like your experience of other people either succeeding or failing, other foreigners succeeding or failing at learning Chinese, what do you think what makes the difference between someone who's successful or not, or in other words, like what kind of advice would you give somebody who's like struggling through the process?
Well, it's undeniable that some people just have a talent, and I have seen people that have studied Chinese in a shorter time than I have, and they're just amazing. So some people are just, and it has to do with age. Sometimes if I talk to those people, they say, "Well, I was in Chinese class when I was 8 years old." Well, then there you go, So there's such a thing as just innate talent and ear, and that's a whole part of it. And I think memory is also very important. I think my Chinese is pretty good, and I think my vocabulary would be better, except that I just don't have a good memory. So, if I'll be saying certain phrases and words and vocabulary because I'm doing a certain project in 2021, but then 3 years later haven't said those words or anything, and I begin to forget what I learned 2 or 3 years ago. But some people don't have that problem. Well, they memorize it and they can keep with it. I think that the thing to do is, because Chinese is so difficult on so many ways, it's kind of a huge ocean of problems and challenges, right? And I think more than any other language of the easy languages, in China, you've got to carve out an area that you want to be fluent in and just concentrate on that.
You mean like a subject matter, like
a
topic?
Either a subject matter, or a kind of language or something like that. You can't just do the sink or swim method. When I was learning French, I just dived into it. It didn't matter. I could pick up things really easily. I don't think you can do that in Chinese even today. You've got to say, "I just want to be able to talk about my job," or "I just want to talk about," and it can be different domains at different times, right? When I started doing music here, I said, well, I've got to learn music vocabulary. So I concentrated on that. And then, now I'm teaching I was teaching a short class on xiangsheng. So I had to, go over those technical terms or that and stuff like that, right? You're not going to just be, because you get so many free words in French, Spanish, Italian that you don't have to learn. But you don't get that in Chinese. You just have to just listen over and over and over again. So I think you just have to be realistic about your goals, which is why a very smart choice, realistic, is how many characters do I need to be able to write? And I would say the answer now in the 21st century is not very many. It's not that important. You're better off spending an hour reading with Pleco, this new wonderful app they have, of just reading as a whole hour writing. Reading would be a much better thing, or even listening, right? I always try to do is my reading inside an app or a computer program, something where I can, if I run across a character I don't know, I can just touch the screen and it gives me the definition and the pinyin. Because I still to this day don't have that reinforcement of the phonetic, right? It's very easy to forget which tone something is, right? You can never ever become like a native speaker. Kids at the age of 0 to whatever they're learning, 8, 9, 10, are really, they're learning something like 100 words a day, and it's sticking in their minds forever. I just couldn't go through that. So I will never be a native speaker. There's always going to be things I don't understand, and that's true. To be honest, it's true of anybody who learns that as a second language when they're an adult. But I think that's all you can be. I go on TV shows, I do talk shows, I do comedy things, I do interviews. I've taught in China, I teach in Chinese very often, and I can. It works. I'm to the stage where it works, and I can say things, and I can sometimes I have to look it up or say, oh well, let's change the subject. That's the stage I always hoped to reach, but the stage of total fluency, I will never reach it. And I talked to Chinese people who are very close to that. They are very, very close to perfect English, but they started learning English when they were 5, and that you can't change that. I mean, I didn't even know China was on the map when I was 5. So the Chinese can do it, and they can get to a very, very, very fluent level. They're not perfect, but that's a dream that I won't accomplish. Now, there are some exceptions. Some of my friends are the best Chinese-speaking foreigners in the world. There's this guy, Da Shan, Mark Roswell, he's legendary. His Chinese is awesome. I mean, you can hear a little bit of foreignness in it, but he's basically got everything at his disposal. But he will even admit, that he has enough at his disposal to really come across as really totally fluent. But he also has weak spots and things that he can't remember, that if he were a native speaker he could. But he's good enough that Chinese people just say he can even recite Tang poetry, and he's better than Chinese people can.
But I'm sure there are Chinese people who forget as much as you do, right? I mean, obviously everybody forgets things all the time in their native language. So, if maybe you're holding yourself to too high of a standard if you're comparing yourself with like a native Chinese person who has a PhD. Like maybe if you compared yourself to somebody who's just a university graduate or something like that.
You're right. I mean, I struggle to find words in English. I struggle to find words in Chinese. In fact, some people have told me that. When I complain to my Chinese people, they say, "You just sound like speaking in English. You stutter, you stop again, you start over from the top, and so on." And I do the same thing in Chinese. It's just the way my mind works. But it's a little different. It's a little bit different than that. I mean, I would say there's a computer term, compiled. You can have it in memory, but when it's compiled, it's in long-term memory. You can always drudge it out. And I think the things that I have in long-term memory in English are more than I have in Chinese. I can get it first. I can be reminded of it, but I can't remember it, a year later or something like that. No, you're right. I mean, there's no such thing, as perfect fluency. And you're right. Nobody speaks perfectly. I guess it's just a matter of, for me, I'm just thinking, what is my goal? And my goal, I've sort of reached it. I want to be able to speak coherently and get my ideas across, and I can do it. So any more than that, it's icing on the cake, I suppose. But
Yeah. In the time since you've been in China, there's been enormous change in the structure of society and like the economic conditions. When you arrived, what expectations did you have about how like the next 30 years of development would occur, right? Like was it a foregone conclusion that China would just like blossom economically and technologically? How optimistic were people back then about the next 30 years of progress?
I think when I got there was definitely a feeling of optimism and a definite hope for the future. As to what specifically that was going to be, that was kind of up in the air. I mean, we could never have imagined not we there are things we could not have imagined because the entire world could not have imagined it. The technical and scientific advances we could not have known in advance. I think the main thing that I think was on the table that everyone was looking forward and thinking it was possible was that people could achieve wealth. People were thinking, I can get this job. If I work hard, I can actually make more money and I can earn much more than my parents make, and then my kids will be able to make much more than I could. There was a lot of emphasis on that kind of economic hopefulness. And so a lot of these people were, trying their everyone was reading business books and books about startups and all this kind of stuff. Just going into the Beijing University bookstore, you know, they'd taken off all the things that had to do with culture, Chinese culture and Confucius and all these books on, how to start a company and so forth, right? I think somebody told me that the Peking University philosophy department only had one PhD student, which means no one was interested in philosophy anymore. They were all getting into business and stuff like that. So I think everyone was thinking that Deng Xiaoping had done the right thing, and they'd already seen miracles. There were suddenly cars on the road instead of bicycles. People were able to buy cars. People were able to, eat meals, enjoy foreign things. They were getting foreign food and foreign clothing and all this kind of stuff. TV had foreign television programs that they were getting in touch with the outside world. So I think there was this rosy image that they were all going to be richer and they were going to be free to go overseas and interact with foreigners and so forth, right? What we didn't imagine was 1989, which would be a big game changer, big game changer. And the tragedy of that was, I think there was still the hope of the economics, and the people, despite what had happened, still had hope that China was going to advance because it was in everyone's interest, right? The sad thing was that there was a sort of a flight from China, that lots of the most prominent intellectuals and stuff left. It got out as fast as they could. The U.S. was giving green cards to anyone who could get out, which many people did. One of the people I knew did. Several of the people I knew did that. And we actually facilitated their trip. So I think that was a big changer. And I think the tragedy everyone felt was the economic aspect just went up, and up. And the hoped for liberation of the mind and soul kind of stagnated and became went on. So yeah, that was a big tipping point. That was something we couldn't have imagined in 1986.
Yeah. I guess, yeah. How do you feel about the future of China going forward? Do you feel the sense of indefinite optimism that everyone felt in the 1980s? What is your vantage point from 2025?
Yeah, that's a hard question because it's so complicated and there's so many variables right now. I think just in general, for me, living here, ironically, despite all the different problems, in some ways it's kind of easier for me to live here than in the United States. One thing, I'm sort of accustomed to the culture. I like the food. A lot of my friends are here and a lot of my challenges are here. But it's also just a very safe, comfortable place to live overall. It's too many people and traffic jams are frustrating. But when I go back to the U.S., it's expensive. Some of the service is not so good as it used to be. People are kind of in nasty moods and everyone's can't talk about anything except politics. It's distressing to go back to the U.S. I went back recently to New York, and it felt bad to go back. It was not a happy country. China, I think, has done something really amazing, which is they've been able to achieve this economic prosperity level and raise standards of living to an incredible extent, and do all of this with a very different economic model than the traditional U.S. and Western one. They were able to take markets, the motive force of capitalism, markets, to build wealth and to create industries, but not laissez-faire markets, not free market capitalism. It's a controlled market capitalism. It's everything technically actually owned by the party, right? Or controlled completely by the party, right? And it turns out that works, that you can still create high tech, high standards of living, and as kind of a contentment of the general people to their style of living, right? Yeah, I think if you did a public opinion poll, probably you would get Xi Jinping would get 80% or more favorable ratings, even if it's a fair assessment, right? I think they really do like what's happening, and there's problems now, and people would complain about them, like every culture, right? So I don't know what's happening, but right now China looks like it's on a pretty good trajectory. They've already solved some of the problems that plagued them during the 1990s, and sometimes they've solved them in ways that we don't like because they involve the strong hand of government. Let's put it that way. But they've also been able to solve a lot of problems that people thought were insoluble, just like feeding and housing 1.4 billion people. And we can only look ahead. Who would have known that the United States would have taken such a hit now in the short space of just a decade that has to do with the internal politics? Who would have imagined that there would be more popularity, that China would enjoy more popularity in many countries than the U.S., that they would have lost a lot of our luster in such a short time? No one could predict that, right? So I don't know what's going to happen. But for the time being, I would say that China is stable. It is very stable. It is not on the edge of another kind of Tiananmen Square or some kind of an outburst. There are people that are very, very disappointed or very, very angry, very, very, they feel very left out. But overall, every society has that. But overall, China is doing a very good job of doing what they should do and what they're supposed to do, what they have to do to stay in power. If they don't do a good job, they lose. The United States can flip back and forth between Republican and Democrat and blame each other. The government here can't do that. So they've got to actually, it's called performance legitimacy. And they've got that in spades, right? So that's my assessment. I like both countries. I love both countries. I feel at home in both countries in some sense. But for right now, my you can tell from what I'm doing, my passions and my intellectual interests are here. And so I'm willing to put up with a lot to stay here. But when I came in the 1980s, it was not an easy place to live. And now it's getting to be almost like the United States. You have air conditioning, you have a swimming pool, you have this and that. It doesn't feel so different, right? So as long as I can, hold off Alzheimer's for a few more years, this is the place I'd like to stay. And my wife, who's Chinese, by the way, used to always say, we should go back to the U.S. It's just so much better there. And she's changed over the last decade. She says, yeah, China's a pretty good place to retire. And that says it all. She was born and raised in China, and she's saying, yeah, coming back here doesn't feel so bad.
Yeah. Great. Any last words? Any last things you'd like to mention for the audience?
Yeah, well, I'd like to laud you for doing this podcast and this kind of podcast. I do think that what we're doing here is really important because what I despair most about these days is the information asymmetry. We Americans don't know much about China, and we get a lot of it from TV nonsense, propaganda, whatever. China knows a lot about us. They know things I don't know because I'm out of it. My young students know things I don't know about in the United States. And it can't go on this way. This is a dangerous situation. We need a new generation of sinologists or China hands who know China and who know Chinese people when the next crisis hits, so that the two sides can work together and not cause a further disaster. We're not there. We really have an information asymmetry. So anything like you're doing, putting these people who do podcasts, people who do China related, social media, the more the better, because the U.S. needs to know what's happening in China, even if nothing else, to get a better comparison about what's happening in their own country. So thank you for your podcast.
Well, thank you. My guest today has been David Moser.